life a lot better. But I want to say how very honored I am to be speaking to the Geshin group today. It's very exciting that Geshin is organizing such a, I think, an innovative and also politically powerful program. So I'm just so delighted that I can be a part of it, and I'd like to thank the Geshin group, and of course thank Professor Chen Tonze for this introduction. And I apologize for not being there, but I think the pandemic has meant lots of us are learning how we can do new things through technology, and it'll be a bit bumpy, but I hope you have patience. So, Professor Chen Tonze asked me about the touch of the other. And so let me tell you a little bit about that. Touch of the other, as she mentioned, is based on the research done in the 1960s by the first gay sociologist in the United States, Lord Humphreys, who was at that time a married minister with a wife, and he seemed to have derived some research pleasure from visiting the local toilets. So we were interested in how the historical records of sex that's long dead, sex that's long over, you know, sex often takes just a few minutes, right? For some of us, it may take longer, but many of these kind of public encounters of sex just took 2 or 3 minutes. But Lord Humphreys was very careful in drawing out a map and diagramming where men would move inside this space. And we can often think of that as a kind of a dirty or repressive or terrible thing, but there's also something quite beautiful in it. And when I saw these maps with the movement marked on them from, what, 60 years ago, more than that, I was so fascinated. How could we bring back this sex from the past? And it was so beautifully presented as a choreography. Could we not stage it again? So it was a very exciting project. And it was right around the time that, especially, I think, you know, in the United States and in Europe, quite a bit of discourse around gay marriage and same-sex marriage, or civil unions, etc. And of course, I'm in favor of civil rights and in favor of equality, but the gay marriage or same-sex marriage discourse was one that was occluding or making more and more invisible a kind of unique gay culture that had emerged in the 20th century. And we were, Takao, my friend, and also a really wonderful performer, were very interested in capturing and recording and keeping that spirit alive in the context of today's civil rights, you know, debates. And of course, in Japan, there have been some places where same-sex unions are recognized at the municipal level or at a very local level, but they carry almost no political weight and no power, no rights, very few. I mean, you can visit the community gym, I guess, with your partner, but not much more than that. So it's in that context that we worked on Touch of the Other, which was at first an American project. And then we brought it to Japan, and yeah, it was an interesting project. And one of the artists that I'm going to be introducing to you today, Takano Ryudai, he was also involved in the project. So I can tell you a little bit more about his involvement when we get to his material. So I will try to be efficient. I'll try to be interesting. And please don't hesitate to stop me if you have questions. We've got this wonderful thing called chat, right? And I love chat because people can have conversations, private conversations about what they're going to do for dinner, or public conversations with, you know, other members in our conference today. So do what you like with the chat, but I'll keep my eye on it. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to post them into the chat if that's allowed. I don't know if that's allowed in this conference, but if it can be.
Yes, I'm sorry, can we share briefly the poster of Touch of the Other? Because I I found where to I hope you see this. This is it.
That's
a
Takao,
poster. That's Takao-san, yes. And the audience was involved directly in the performance because everybody was missed A, B, C, the positions. I remember all the positions, and people from the audience had to pose in a certain way, recreating the map of Humphrey, because all these detailed descriptions of these encounters, you put them into the performance. So this was really an interesting, yes.
The poster,
yeah.
The poster that you're showing,
yeah.
Is a photograph that's taken by Takano Ryudai. So he's one of the artists I mentioned later.
Perfetto.
And the very toilet he is in, this is a public toilet.
In Shinjuku.
No, not this one. This one is actually located in the southeast part of Tokyo in a new area. And it is the site of one of the most notorious anti-gay bashing murder incidents. The very toilet. So it's a kind of a tragic site. There isn't a long history of direct murderous violence against gay people. It's in fact largely a contemporary phenomenon, gay bashing in Japan. It does not have a long history. And we could probably say that history, the history of gay bashing, is tied in some ways to the increased visibility of gay men and of lesbians. Yeah. Anyway, just I was glad to see the poster. That's Takao. Really wonderful performance. No matter what he's doing, he's usually excellent. He's always excellent.
Great. Yes, he's great. Yes. Okay, thank you. Now, please, Jonathan, let's start from Takano-san, if you want.
No, we'll leave him to the end. Leave him to the end.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, and so I'll just share my screen, and I think today's lecture will be around somewhere around 30 to 40 minutes, plus I have some clips. So I think it should be around 40 to 50 minutes in total. But if you're getting tired, you can also let me know, and I can speed up or slow down, etc. Also, there are some slight differences in today's presentation from the abstract. I'm happy to raise and talk with you in the question and answer time later if we have any about issues that were mentioned in the abstract that I don't cover in my talk, if you came for those specific reasons. All right, so let me share my screen. And if you have any technical issues, you can't hear me, etc., please let me know, and I shall.
It's perfect now. Yes.
Shall let you do something. All right, let me just. Oops, slideshow. Okay, so today's talk is entitled Neither Nude Nor Naked, Queer Exposure and the Japanese Body. This is my email address at the bottom. It's very easy, just my first name and my last name at UCR for UC Riverside EDU. And if you would like to contact me for any reason, please do so. I'm always very happy to talk with students, whether you're doing queer research or non-queer research, Japanese research, Asian research, or just something experimental and interesting, whatever it is, I'm always happy to engage. So we'll start today with something that may be a little rudimentary for students if you've taken art history classes, but I think it's good to kind of set the basis. And also there's a bit of a cultural difference because I'm coming from the Anglo-American context where we of course have a different language and a different intellectual tradition, slightly different intellectual tradition. So as you can see from the title's talk, it's a space that I'm introducing that is neither nude nor naked. So this dichotomy, the opposition between nude and naked, is suggested in the title talk. And when we take a look at these images, I would ask, what do you see? Do you see something, someone that is nude? Do you see someone, something that is naked? So on the left-hand side, we have the very famous, possibly an image of Aphrodite, possibly not, discovered on the Greek island of Milos, now known to us as the Venus de Milo. And on the right hand, Lycaon and his three sons, kind of image of the destruction of a powerful Trojan leader, suffering here. And of course, the serpents destroying the father and his three sons. So in this image, in these are statues, of course, do you see nakedness? Do you see nudity? What is it that you see? We'll take a look at move a little further ahead. Oops. Or here, how about some really classical images from our more recent past? Pierre-Auguste Renoir's Blonde Bather from 1881, or Paul Cézanne's Three Bathers, also roughly around the same period, 1879 to 1882. Do you see something, someone that is naked, or someone that is nude, or something else? The question here of nakedness and of nudity, of course, is central, especially in the Anglo-American art historical tradition, in understanding these paintings and, of course, the statues that we saw right prior. In some ways, I wonder whether this is a specifically Anglo-American problem. So I was very shocked to hear from Professor Gentonze that that there isn't really a word in Italian for naked, or not, at least not commonly used, or perhaps the opposition is
for nude.
For nude is for nude. I see. So part of me is wondering that maybe much of my talk is really dealing with an English problem, a problem that may not make as much sense to you. But even if the words don't make sense, I hope you can follow me conceptually, because I think the ideas are still important, even if the vocabulary between Italian and English doesn't match. So we'll be working with some key texts today, three texts initially. And this is the kind of rudimentary art history. Maybe you took an art history class and it's been a while, so this will be a refresher. But if it's new material for you, great, because I think we need to lay it out in order to understand what is the space in between the naked and the nude. So the three initial texts we'll work with are texts again in the Anglo-American tradition, actually each of them English. Kenneth Clark's The Nude from 1956, John Berger's Ways of Seeing, which was a book published in 1972 following a very popular BBC television series. And we'll take a look at a few minutes from that television series. And also Linda Need's very powerful book. It's one of my favorite books, The Female Nude, Art, Obscenity, Sexuality from 1993. And we notice that they're basically about 20 years apart. And in particular, I'm very much influenced by Need, and the chapter that I'm borrowing from quite considerably is at the beginning of her book called A Discourse on the Naked and the Nude. So if you have an interest in today's lecture, I highly recommend you go and check that chapter out. So let's start with Kenneth Clark. Kenneth Clark describes naked and nudity in this way. Being naked is being without clothes. The nude is a form of art. So in the former category, nakedness, some kind of loss, some kind of absence, missing something, whereas the nude rises, right? It rises into the position of being a form, and not just any form, but a form of art. Let's consider a little bit the implications of Kenneth Clark's position. Now, Clark is famous for, as I described, his 1956 book called The Nude, and it's been critiqued since many, many times, but it still remains one of the most authoritative texts in any Western language that is a discussion of the nude. So let's take a look at Clark's dichotomy. What does he set up? Now, when I say dichotomy, I mean an opposition, but not just any opposition, a very powerful opposition that itself creates meaning, that the opposition itself is a forceful, creating opposition. And we see the, on the left-hand side, naked, something that is associated with being stripped and shamed, contorted, bent, weak, defenseless, something that is real as opposed to ideal, something that is bodily, something that's degraded. And even if the depiction is male, still feminine in its, we could say, aura, or feminine in its mood. Against this, we could say, weak feminine position of nakedness that Clarke argues for, there is something that he argues for its opposite in the nude. So we see the nude is, all right, doesn't have clothing, but it's clothed in pride. It's clothed in a certain kind of regal stance, usually. Even the suffering of Laocoon and Laocoon and his sons, they're suffering, they're being punished, but still there's an incredible kind of pride and beauty in their bodies. The nude is balanced. It's usually prosperous. We don't see emaciated bodies. We usually see full-formed bodies, and especially in those late 19th century paintings, we saw very kind of full-formed bodies. We see confidence. We see some kind of ideal, something that is at the level of the mind, the cognitive, the spiritual, as opposed to the level of the body. Something that is sublime, that brings us high and towards a feeling of grandeur, or a feeling of kind of intellectual or spiritual kind of ascent. And the nude, regardless of whether it's depicting a male or a female, and almost the vast majority, of course, of nudes are of females, it's a kind of masculine genre, intended, most likely, for a masculine viewer. Now, we can complicate that. This is not the truth about naked and nude. This is Clarke's structure that he sets up in his book. Let's take a look at what he writes. It's a very interesting passage. I'll read it out loud, but please read it by yourself if you like. The desire to grasp and to be united with another human body is so fundamental a part of our nature that our judgment of what is known as pure form is inevitably influenced by it. And one of the difficulties of the nude as a subject for art is that these instincts cannot be hidden, but are dragged into the foreground, where they risk upsetting the unity of responses from which a work derives its independent life. Even so, the amount of erotic content which a work of art can hold in solution is very high. So Need's, Linda Need is the one who cited this passage. It's a quite well-known passage from Kenneth Clarke, and we'll just take a little bit of time to analyze it. So, of course, Clarke is very much interested in the independent life of a work of art. So in very typical kind of mid-20th century, he understands art as something that speaks to the higher purposes of mankind, that is has a power in and of itself. It has an independent life. It's not simply a mere quote unquote reflection of culture. It is an independent object. This is a very romantic understanding of the work of art. But in particular, what's interesting in this passage is the way in which Clarke describes our attraction, the desire to be united with another human body. So this is the desire for intimacy, for sex, for love, for a quickie, whatever you'll have, that these are so fundamental to our being that they must influence what we think good art is, what we think a pure form of art is. And for this reason, it's the nude that especially foregrounds these instincts. And if those instincts, the desire for sex, is dragged into the foreground too much, it risks upsetting the work of art as a work of art. So if our viewing is too erotic, Clark is saying, the work of art risks, it's at risk. It risks being damaged, in a sense, by our dirty thoughts, you could say. However, he is confident the amount of erotic content which a work of art can hold in solution is very high. So the idea here, let's take a look at this passage, in solution. So this is almost a kind of chemical understanding that you can dissolve substances in water, right? That's what we say, or dissolve them in any liquid. That would be in solution. And, excuse me. The idea then is that a work of art can actually sustain a very great amount of erotic content. So there's some idea here of the idea of sublimation. So sublimation is the concept that Freud wrote about, whereby our erotic desires can be channeled and transformed away from the sexual and into some kind of civilizing great force. And for Freud, it was Leonardo da Vinci, it was a great example of the power of sublimation. So for Freud, it was Leonardo's repressed homosexuality that actually drove him to become, made him a great genius. Not that repression makes everyone a genius. You have to have some other qualities, I think, but it was the repression for Leonardo that pushed him towards his greatness. But rather than just being repressed and suffering, it's actually not repression, it's this form called sublimation. So there's a concept of sublimation that is working here in Clark. But it's not a pure sublimation because the sexual is very, very close to the surface. All right, so this is Clark. And you'll see we'll work through these and we'll be done, about halfway through, and we'll move to our Japanese content. So when we're thinking about the context that Clark is describing, viewing a work of art, we have to know that Clark takes many things for granted. And in, I think, our contemporary era, especially informed by queer theory, informed by gender studies, some things that stand out to us were never really addressed by Clark. And those are questions of gender and questions of sex. Clark describes the scene of someone viewing a nude statue or a nude painting in this way. Basically, the scene of the nude is a cisgendered. So each of the genders is, we could say, naturalized. There is a way in which there is a presumption, an assumption, sometimes false, but an assumption of quote unquote, natural coherence of gender expression and of sexual biological being, right? So we call that cisgendered. So there's a cisgendered representation of what is a heterosexual dynamic. Clark is not interested in the relationship of a woman viewing a woman, the nude of a woman, nor is he interested in a kind of homosexual relation imagined in the space of art. The nude is almost always in Clark's world female, and the creator of the nude and the observer of the nude are also figured as male. So this is a very kind of, we could say, normative, heterosexual, compulsorily heterosexual context that Kenneth Clark imagines. So against Kenneth Clark's established authority, we see another 20th century scholar, a very, very popular scholar, actually, a kind of public intellectual, John Berger. And Berger, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I've heard both. So let's go with Berger. Berger says in 1972, to be naked is to be oneself. So let's take a look at a 4 minute clip of the beginning of this BBC series that I mentioned that Berger created. And this is the second episode of it. And it might come across as offensive to you. I hope you don't take offensive at it. Just think of it in its historical setting. And it's a historical setting, of course, of feminism and of an awareness, increased awareness of questions of objectification of the female body. In many regards, Berger is playing the role of a sensitive New Age guy, a kind of quote unquote anti-patriarchal male authority. There's a bit of a contradiction in there, but that's the role that Berger is playing. We'll take a look at a clip from the very beginning of part 2 of the BBC series from 1972. You can see I like Saturday Night Live. All right. Yeah, I think you can see.
Dream of themselves being dreamt of.
Let's try that again.
Men dream of women. Women dream of themselves being dreamt of. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. Women constantly meet glances which act like mirrors, reminding them of how they look or how they should look. Behind every glance is a judgment. Sometimes the glance they meet is their own, reflected back from a real mirror. A woman is always accompanied, except when quite alone, perhaps even then, by her own image of herself. While she is walking across a room or weeping at the death of her father, she cannot avoid envisaging herself walking or weeping. From earliest childhood, she is taught and persuaded to survey herself continually. She has to survey everything she is and everything she does, because how she appears to others, and particularly how she appears to men, is of crucial importance for what is normally thought of as the success of her life. A woman in the culture of privileged Europeans is first and foremost a sight to be looked at. What kind of sight is revealed in the average European oil painting? There were portraits of women as there were portraits of men, but in one category of painting, women were the principal, ever-recurring subject. That category was the nude. In the nudes of European painting, we can discover some of the criteria and conventions by which women were judged. We can see how women were seen. What then is a nude? In his book on the nude, Kenneth Clark says that being naked is simply being without clothes. The nude, according to him, is a form of art. I would put it differently. To be naked is to be oneself. To be nude is to be seen naked by others and yet not recognized for oneself. A nude has to be seen as an object in order to be a nude. In the European oil painting, nakedness is not taken for granted as in archaic art. Nakedness is a sight for those who are dressed. That is why Manet's painting, which really marks the end of the period I'm considering, is so profound a comment on all the works which preceded it. The story begins with a story.
Okay, so we will.
And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food.
Just stop there. Thank you for your patience. That is, of course, John Berger, and we see a very different position from Kenneth Clark, but something that seems similarly frustrating and irritating. Another male, another expert telling and authoritating on the representation of women. Let's take a look at conceptually what is the shift that happens from Kenneth Clark to John Berger. So for Berger, we see a reversal of the terms. For, as he said, to be a nude is to be an object. To be naked is to be oneself. So there is a fundamental reversal of terms. And if we start on the right-hand side, we can see in the nude, the self is lost. The nude is artificial. The nude is expressed. The nude is within a patriarchal culture. The nude is consumed, and the nude is objectified. Against this, we see the positive qualities, very typical of a 1970s, late 60s, 1970s kind of revolutionary spirit, so the era of social transformation, of the recalibration of certain gendered relations. And in this world, we can see also fantasies and spirits of kind of free love, gay liberation, etc. And in this context, to be naked is to be oneself, to be natural, to be expressive, to be liberated, to be partaking. So not to be consumed, but to be consuming, but not in a capitalist sense, to be partaking, to be enjoying the fruits of life, and not to be objectified, but to be holistic, to be a whole thing. So we took a look at that clip, and YouTube reminds me it's age restricted, but I don't think we saw anything too naughty. Let's consider a little further what makes Berger both interesting but also problematic. So here's a long quotation. Again, this is a quotation that Linda Need cites. But she doesn't cite the whole thing, but I pulled this from his book. There are a few exceptional nudes in the European tradition of oil painting to which very little of what has been said above applies. So now he's talking about a special category. Indeed, they are no longer nudes. They break the norms of the art form. They are paintings of loved, excuse me, let me just, need to move, zoom. They're paintings of loved women, more or less naked. Among the hundreds of thousands of nudes which make up the tradition, there are perhaps 100 of these exceptions. In each case, the painter's personal vision of the particular women he is painting is so strong that it makes no allowance for the spectator. So here in this image of Danae, Rembrandt's painting of what was first in the original 1636 painting, the likeness, at least at the level of face, of his wife. And then in the 1940s, he repainted it, so it looked like his mistress. But in any case, we see a way in which here the woman reclining is clearly engaging with another subject off the side of the painting. So this is actually a detail. There's more of the painting. We can see more of the room and the divan, the bed upon which she's lying. But still, we can't quite see to whom she is extending her arm with a kind of loving gaze, right? So John Berger continues. The painter's vision binds the woman to him so that they become as inseparable as couples in stone. Very romantic here, wow. The spectator can witness their relationships, or we can witness the relationship between the portrayed woman and the person suggested at the edge of the picture, the painter, most likely. We can witness their relationship, but we, can do no more. He is forced to recognize himself as the outsider he is. He cannot deceive himself into believing that she is naked for him. So for all of Berger's kind of liberatory condemnation of the objectification of women, a kind of feminist position, for all that we see, there's something very unique happening here and maybe a bit problematic. Let's examine. And I think Nude again, you can see why I'm such a fan of her. Linda Nude is the one who helps us do that. So Linda Nude writes, there can be no naked other to the nude, for the body is always already in representation. And since there is no recourse to a semiotically innocent and unmediated body, we must be content to investigate the diverse ways in which women's bodies are represented and to promote new bodily images and identities. So it's this first part of the quotation here. So our three scholars, our three kind of theorists of the nude, she is here critiquing Berger. She's saying, well, you know, Berger critiques the tradition of the nude. He critiques the sexism in it. He critiques the patriarchy, the objectification, but he finds a special place that he calls love. A very romantic image, a pastoral image of a space at the edge, far from the city, where lovers can go and be, quote unquote, true to each other. This fantasy of a kind of escape from patriarchy in the romantic couple. We saw already the very strong language that Berger had of the romantic couple linked, bonded as if they were in stone. And Linda Nude is saying, no, that's completely fanciful. There is no other space. Every space is in some kind of system of representation. We can't go to a pure body. We can't find pure love. You may have experienced pure love yourself, but it probably still is socially conditioned. There's not actually some true and pure escape. And Linda Nude says, rather we must be content to investigate the diverse ways in which bodies are represented. We must think about women's bodies and promote new images and identities. So Nude here is sensitive, of course, to maybe some of the images that we saw in the BBC documentary suggested to you anorexia, right? The very skinny models we saw coming out in those 1970s images. And of course, the rise, especially in the late 20th century, of this very severe psychological but also physical illness that especially targets women. Perhaps we could say a disease of our culture and of our body. So Nude is calling for, it's a feminist position. It's rejecting both the conservative Kenneth Clark and also the more, you could say, progressive or liberatory John Berger. That for both of them, they both are incapable of understanding, the argument is, the ways in which women's bodies are always subject to a regimen of representation. So So this is a feminist position. Of course, 1993 is a time when queer theory is emerging, and this is not a queer theoretical position. I don't think Need's approach is hostile to a queer theoretical position, but in some ways it's too early. The timing is wrong. And let's pursue what we can think of in terms of a queer approach. So we'll turn to Japanese materials now as well. So when we think about the tradition of the nude, there is not a high art tradition of the nude in the Japanese context. It seems that it's the same. There's a very interesting philosophical book comparing the history of high art in Europe with the history of high art in China, called The Impossible Nude, which the argument therein is that in the East Asian high artistic tradition, a nude is impossible. There's some problems with the book, but if you're curious in that topic, look for it, The Impossible Nude. I believe it was published in French first and then in English. Maybe there's an Italian translation. Of course, there's some problems with that theory, but it presents, at least in the title alone, some idea of the dissonance, of the difference between the Euro-American context and the East Asian context. So traditionally, Japanese painting, nihonga, using mineral paints derived from ground minerals, not oil paints. That's the defining quality of nihonga, which literally means Japanese image. There's a tradition called the bijinga, the image of the beautiful woman, bijin being a beauty. And we see on the left-hand side, Uemura Shoen, a female expert in the Nihonga tradition. There were female artists, and in fact, female artists in the Nihonga tradition were thought to be especially competent and capable at capturing the beauty and aesthetic of women subjects. So this is the traditional, we could say. There are influences of the West already in the very image. It's an image from the first half of the 20th century, but the tradition of Nihonga itself goes back to before European contact. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, we see an image from roughly the same period, and this is a yoga meaning a Western image. So this is an image made by a Japanese painter, Kuroda Seiki, a male painter, called Nobe, done in, I believe it's 1907. I should say it, yes, 1907. And this is rafu. So rafu specifically means ra, naked, fu, woman. So here we have the term nude, but already specified, meaning nude woman. We'll talk about Japanese terms in a moment, but we see in the early 20th century the arrival of Western painting traditions to Japan. We see numerous Japanese artists going to Europe, studying especially in Paris, and learning what's going on in European art, learning the techniques of oil painting, and then bringing those techniques back to Japan. Now, this image in 1907, when it was published, was critiqued and criticized for being immoral. But it's very interesting. We can actually see that Kuroda Seiki made a first image when he was traveling in Europe based on a European model with blonde hair. And it was recently discovered and displayed after being hidden away for 120 years. It was just in the news last month. And here we see, of course, his adaptation of the European female nude, portrayed with very light skin and with blonde hair, into a female body that looks more Japanese, right? We can call this the kind of domestication of the nude into Japanese art culture. So here, dark hair, smaller breasts, something that looks, quote unquote, more at home in the Japanese context. Now, this is not to say that all women in Japan look like this, or all women in Japan have this color hair or this size breasts. No, there's a great diversity, of course, in the Japanese population. But this approximates a certain kind of stereotype of female beauty. Now, we see the tradition of the nude in Japan, specifically in the wake of contact with Euro-America. The first, of course, nude women images are done in oil painting and are considered scandalous, but they are eventually accepted by the art world in the late 1930s. So the Japanese artists come back and bring back this European style of oil painting and slowly create the context for the emergence of a Japanese nude. Now, we'll get back to the terms later, but the Japanese nude is almost always female. Now, as you know, Japan has strict censorship laws, obscenity laws that forbid the showing of genitalia in public settings. And particularly considered licentious or problematic is pubic hair. We could say the pubic hair line, the Iron Curtain, so to speak, was crossed in 1991. This is photographer Shinoyama Kishin photographing Miyazawa Rie in 1991. According to Japanese law, she was underage at the time. So owning this book would put you in violation of contemporary censorship laws or controls about the circulation of images of minors. However, this was a very popular book. It only had one image with pubic hair and sold off the shelves 1.5 million copies. And since then, the hair nude, as it's called, has been a significant tradition in Japanese photography. Going back to the 1930s, we can see that the nude is very much the territory or the property, the terrain of the male creator, the male artist. Hasegawa Haruko was another oil painter, a female oil painter who traveled to Paris, lived in Paris for 3 years in the mid-1930s. And she had an interest in painting the female body, but had so much, you could say, reaction or critique of the kind of suitability of such a project that she penned instead this illustration in her autobiographical book, a kind of a comic of a sorts, where we see looks like a European man with a big beard and a hat. Probably this is from her time in Paris, looking at a female nude. But of course, there's no head. And where's the man looking? He seems, because of the brim of his hat, to be unable to see anywhere higher than the genital region. So we see here very clearly a kind of critique of the idea of the nude as a sexist terrain for Japanese men and also, of course, European men as well. Now, Hasegawa Haruko is very interesting because she writes that the body is the currency of the nation. And I'm pulling here from work done by a very wonderful scholar of the yoga, of the Western oil painting art tradition in Japan, Bert Tamaki Winter. And he has a superb book called Maximum Embodiment. And in that, he describes Hasegawa Haruko's sitting in Paris and observing the fleshy bodies of the European women who are walking down the streets of Paris. And she compares them with the Japanese body, which she finds smaller, lacking power. And she creates this moniker, this motto, so to speak: the body is the currency of the nation. So part of Hasegawa Haruko's goal was to, in fact, make Japan a stronger country by improving the Japanese body itself. You needed to have a better body for better art and for a better country. This is, in some ways, we could call it the nationalization of the body, instigated by the nude. Let's take a look at one more figure from this early 20th century period. This is Umehara Ryuzaburo. And Umehara is one of the very, very few artists, male artists in Japan, who has drawn a male nude. And this is 1915. It's in fact, again, modeled on a previous painting he had done when he was in Paris. Like Kuroda Seiki, who had a kind of blonde in the image he drew in Paris, and then a dark-haired Japanese-looking woman in the image he drew in Japan, Umehara also had drawn a kind of Narcissus in a Parisian context with lighter hair, a fuller body, and now back in Japan, Umehara has a smaller body, darker hair, a less, you could say, romantic portrayal of the body in general. This is we could call it the transnational kind of circulation and the nationalization of images of the nude. So let's turn now to think about queer theory and move forward to some contemporary artists. And when I say contemporary, so some of them will be 50, 60 years ago, but from the mid-20th century onwards. And I'd like to turn also to a younger scholar of queer cinema studies, queer theory, who writes that queer culture has necessarily been improvisational. It has required an extra domestic elaboration. It has relied on ephemeral uses of space as its condition of possibility. So it's precisely this in-between space, an extra domestic, some kind of elaboration of desire that takes place outside the house, outside the space of matrimony, outside the space of the couple. Queer culture has traditionally, because it's not been morally sanctioned, because it's been morally critiqued and not associated with the family system, it's often found its, you could say, its pleasures and its relationships and its culture in fleeting external spaces. The ephemeral use of space, the fleeting use, the quick use of space as a condition of possibility. So let's think about this kind of quick use of space by a series of artists in the Japanese context who are dealing with nakedness, who are foregrounding nakedness, and who I would call queer artists. They're not necessarily gay or lesbian or even part of an LGBT community, but they're queer in the sense that their work is problematizing the dichotomy between naked and nude. So let's, as we move into our Japanese context, take a look at the term hadaka. So I think some of you in the room may be studying Japanese, and hadaka is the way in which we generally say naked. So here's Yato Tamotsu's Hadaka Matsuri, Naked Festival Series. So Yato took these photographs in the 1960s, basically from 1962 through the end of the 1960s, of Japanese traditional animistic Shinto naked festivals, which were beginning to disappear as tradition. As the country urbanized, local farming traditions disappeared. These moments of, you could say, hypermasculinity, of intense nakedness, of contest, celebration, struggle, were disappearing. Now, Yato, of course, was a gay man. He is known for his photography of Mishima Yukio, the very famous Japanese author who committed ritual disembowelment, seppuku, harakiri, after an aborted or unsuccessful attempt to take over the self-defense force headquarters in Tokyo, the Japanese army headquarters. So Mishima was part of a kind of right-wing celebration, a homosexual, fascistic celebration of a lost masculinity. And in some ways we can view Yato as Mishima's photographer and friend as sharing some of these same ideas. Now, interestingly, Yato's boyfriend was an American, and he lived together with his partner in a house that was featured in Japanese women's magazines. his partner, John Weatherby. Weatherby, of course, is the name of an American, a Texan who had moved to Tokyo in the 1940s following the end of World War II. And like many gay American men who identified their home culture, American culture, as especially homophobic, which it remains today, but it was especially in the 1940s and 1950s, decided to remain in Japan. So we see the emergence of a kind of hybrid culture that's mixing American fantasies of, quote unquote, the hot Asian guy with your Japanese fantasies of a lost masculinity, of a pre-war samurai or agrarian tradition. This is already one way in which the nude, the naked man, is being hybridized and shifted geographically and temporally in yet another direction. So this book was part of three books, or was one of three books that Yato published in Japanese. Two other books, Young Samurai and then later Otoko, Man, were much more clearly targeting a kind of a closet buyer of male physique images. And the third book itself was published in Los Angeles by a book press that was known for publishing gay physique photographs. Let's take a look at some Japanese terms, since I think some of you have been learning Japanese. And we won't spend too long on this, just 2 or 3 minutes. But I've assembled here a nice glossary, so you can take this with you if you go to Japan and make sure you're using all the right words. So hadaka, we can probably translate that from naked festival as something that is not quite the same as the English word naked. Of course, naked in English usually means having no clothing. Sometimes naked can mean bare-chested, so having trousers or having underpants. But the majority of usage in English for naked is completely naked. Whereas in Japanese, the standard word for nakedness, hadaka, includes the wearing of a loincloth, includes underwear. You are already naked if you're in your underwear. There's some more terms we can bring out. Maru hadaka, completely naked. Spadaka, stark naked, or in American slang, buck naked or butt naked. And marumie, so when a private part, anus, genitalia, breasts, etc., are completely visible, one can say marumie, completely exposed. Now, if we move to this second list, we can see some more formal terms that are associated with arts and the spaces of sculpture, painting, and also performance. Ratai is the term that is introduced to correspond to the Western concept of the nude, referring here to nude or to a naked body, but particularly understood in the context of creative space. However, ratai quickly falls out of favor. As I mentioned before, the yoga, the Western painting drawer, the Western oil painting artists who are Japanese, bringing this tradition from Paris, had very little interest in portraying male bodies. And so ratai quickly turned to rafu, replacing the term ratai by the 1930s. So we see rafu meaning female nude, becoming the standard term. Some other terms, rataizo, nude form, or later in the world of photography, especially nudo, or what I showed earlier, Shinoyama Kishin's pubic hair nudes, called the hair nudo. So I'd like to introduce now some Japanese artists who are all working in the context of nakedness, or of stripping, or of nudity. And but let me stop for a moment to see if there are any questions along the way. Are we fine? All right. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat. So we'll introduce to you now an avant-garde group from the 1960s called High Red Center. So for those of you who know Japanese, Takamatsu, Taka meaning high, Akasegawa, these are all family names, Aka meaning red, and Nakanishi, Naka meaning center. So High Red Center was an avant-garde group created by these three men in the context of the Olympics. So 1964, the Olympics were held in Japan, and the effort to clean up the city, to clean up Tokyo, to build the bullet train, to build highways, to remove kind of suggestions of the old, dirty pre-war city. This is one of the kind of moments of the transformation of Tokyo into a modern metropolis. And it's in this moment that these artists took issue. They understood that the concern for hygiene, the concern for cleanliness, was itself a kind of overreach of state control. And were very suspicious of the Olympics project. Even today in Japan, when the Olympics were supposed to be held last year because of, were canceled because of COVID, the coronavirus, the same tradition of kind of suspicion of anti-Olympic politics occurred. But in 1964, so the very year of the Olympics, these are straight artists, straight men, get a room, rent a room in the Imperial Hotel, the best hotel in Tokyo. And there they conduct their High Red Center shelter plan. So the shelter plan consisted of visitors coming to visit this hotel room, registering, being weighed, having their bodies measured, producing a whole kind of, you could say, government control and parroting government control over the body. And it's in this context that we see the emergence of the male nude. Here's the male nude photographed. So in this hotel room in Tokyo, these images, male nudes from the rear, were photographed and put up against the wall. And in between them is a young woman who is visiting the room and having her photograph taken next to the nudes. We see a kind of play with the question of who is being observed. It seems like the males, especially showing their butts, are in some kind of almost embarrassing or humiliating position. And we have the clothed woman standing in between them. But she herself is being photographed. So this is actually a production still. It's an image of the production of this movie. Sorry, there was a movie made of this particular event. Also, we see very surprising in the highly controlled context of Japan and Japan's obscenity laws. Here, an image of a naked man getting into the bath. Now, I like to think of this as a queer image because it's creating a false domestic space. Whereas often we might say LGBT or queer identified artists need to go out from the home to create a space. Here we have the creation of a kind of domestic space, the recreation of a domestic space in a hotel, a kind of play with interior and exterior that the artists are working through. And of course, who shows up? But one of the most significant post-war avant-garde artists, Yoko Ono. So Yoko Ono was very interested in questions of nakedness and questions of stripping and of being forced to strip. Let's take a look at a clip of a very, very powerful and disturbing performance piece that Yoko Ono enacted, a one-person show called Cut Piece, where she invited in 1965 members of the audience to come up to cut her clothes from her body. We'll just watch a few minutes here. So we can see here both men and women coming up from the audience. Basically, this is a kind of experiment. How far will the audience go? Will they strip a woman nude? The suggestions here of sexual violence, the hint of something that certainly is a synonym or a parallel to rape. Sexual violence against women is also suggested. And of course, this is done in the context of a Japanese, Yoko Ono's from a wealthy family, a well-known figure in the avant-garde world, and here exposing herself, so to speak, or being exposed, asking the audience to expose her. A very radical performance in the context of 1965 Japan. I think you know Yoko Ono from her more recent work, or perhaps from her marriage to the Beatles, John Lennon. But I think we can find something extremely provocative and interesting, and I would also claim queer, in this reformulation of the relations of power between audience and performer, and also the presentation of the violence of the production of the nude. These qualities, I think, are really elicited beautifully by this surprising cut piece. Let's shift gear. Let's talk about some other work that's happening in the 1960s. So I'd like to introduce to you another film. And this, in fact, we will, I believe we have time to watch the entire film. But if we don't, Professor Centonze, please send me a message. But I believe we have time to watch the entire 14-minute film by Donald Ritchie called Dead Youth. Now, this is Donald Ritchie is a very prominent scholar in the context of Japanese film studies. He passed away about 10 years ago. But Ritchie was the first person to write a book on Japanese film director Kurosawa Akira, the first person to write a book also on Ozu. And in fact, surprisingly, the first person in English to write a book on any single film director. The idea of writing a book on only one director had not been invented until Ritchie came up with this plan. So Ritchie, like Meredith Weatherby, Yato Tamotsu, the photographer's boyfriend, came from the United States, was stationed in Japan as part of the occupying force in Japan from 1945 to 1952, and was also a gay man. The connection between Weatherby and Ritchie is stronger than that. They were close friends, and they ended up living together for several years in an old Japanese farmhouse that was transported from the mountains west of Tokyo to the district called Roppongi, kind of area very close to where the American bases in Tokyo used to be. So Ritchie is probably the first gay filmmaker to make an explicitly gay film in Japan. It's based on a poem by Takahashi Mutsuo. And just because it may be a little hard to hear the voice at first, here's actually a photograph of Takahashi by a Japanese photographer, Hosue Eiko. Takahashi was a poet. We will watch this film, which is about the public space of intimacy and also foregrounds some fleeting images of nakedness as well. So the poem that will begin the film's first 2 minutes has no image, but, and this was a money-saving device. They couldn't afford subtitles, so Donald Ritchie reads out the English translation of a Japanese poem, and then we hear Takahashi Mutsuo's voice read the same poem. I'll just read it in English for us now. I'm like a boy who suddenly, from the summit of dreadful childhood, without knowing what love is, has fallen into the darkness of a well. Water's dark hands wring my weak throat. Familiar glances of that cold pierce and slaughter my wet and fish-like heart. My bowels swell like flowers and spread across the surface of those underground waters. And from the green horn between my thighs, soon a single sprout will rise, crawling with delicate fingers up to the heavy ground. A tree like a pale face will someday sway in the painful light. As much as that part of night in me, I want that part of day. So this is very much suggests an idea of the closet, an idea of a kind of repressed sexuality, a very physical, of course, depiction of a boy with the green horn. So a boy at the cusp, we could say, of puberty or in puberty at a moment of sexual awakening. So let's take a look at the film. 13 minutes and some seconds by Donald Ritchie called Dead Youth. Oops, excuse me.
I am a boy who suddenly, from the summit of dreadful childhood, without knowing what love is, has fallen into the darkness of a well. Water's dark hands wring my weak throat. The myriad glances of that cold pierce and slaughter my wet and fish-like heart. My bowels swell like flowers and spread across the surface of those underground waters. And from the green horn between my thighs, soon a single sprout will rise, crawling with delicate fingers up to the heavy ground. A tree, like a pale face, will someday sway in the painful light. As much as that part of night in me, I want that part of day.
僕は愛も知らず、恐ろしい幼年時代の頂から突然井戸の暗みに落ち込んだ少年だ。暗い水の手が僕のひ弱な喉を締め、冷たさの無数の霧が押し入ってきては、僕の魚のように濡れた心臓を僕はすべての内臓で花のように膨れ、地下水の表面を水平に動いていく。僕の股の青臭い角からは、やがて頼りない根が生え、重苦しい土をか細い手で這い登っていくだろう。青ざめた顔のような一本の木、痛い光の下にそよぐ日が来るだろう。僕は影の部分と同じほど、僕の中に光の部分が欲しい。
Oh, you can't see the video? Can you see the video?
We were seeing the video.
You were,
and then,
okay.
And then
All
I
right.
think it suddenly stopped.
I thought you couldn't see it. I'll show it again. Just 1 second. Just 1 second, please. I'm gonna go back to where we left off. So here we see the very surprisingly kind of early production, a very direct expression of a kind of gay sensibility. Even in the United States at this point, this is made in 1967, there are very few even gay shorts being made at the time. There's some work by Kenneth Anger, of course, or some psychedelic pieces coming out of New York, Jack Smith, Ron Rice, etc. But for the most part, this kind of, we could call it a more sentimental or more poetic kind of film is probably the first of its kind at a global level. So quite extraordinary film coming from Japan, made by an American, but working, of course, with Japanese staff and working with Japanese actors. So Richie also had 7 years earlier made a film with Hijikata Tatsumi, the founder of Ankoku Buto, about which Professor Chentonze is very much an expert. And I think she can tell you also about the importance or the role that images and ideas of homosexuality played in early Buto. However, taking a look at this film, we see I'd like to point out a few things. I'm going to share my screen again so you can just take a look at the poem one more time that was recited at the beginning. Just while I'm speaking, if you want to read it again, you can. So we see here 3 dominant spaces: the space of a park, which is some kind of cruising space. We see the space of the cemetery, which is a space of memory, memorial, a family memory, but a very personal, onanistic, ejaculatory, masturbatory rite performed in front of the grave. And then this kind of no man's land that is the shore, where this body, corpse, I guess, of possibly a dead youth has washed up or is lying on the shore. We also see the kind of expression of desire very much in an elliptical way and triangulated. So we understand the dead youth is a source, perhaps the loss is a source of mourning, but we're not quite sure exactly what the relation is. Who is mourning whom? And right at the very center of the film, we see this montage sequence of a whole series of photographs of young men. And at first it might seem like these are the dead youth, a singular dead youth, but no, the images reveal themselves to be of very different people, of different youths. So is dead youth a singular? Is dead youth a plural? Is the attraction a singular? Is the attraction plural? We have very much a kind of playing with the idea of gay male desire as distributed across this semi-public, semi-private space, playing also with these images of nakedness. Of course, the stunning pubic mountain, pubic hair mountain on the beach of the boy lying there, but also the images of nakedness in the bathtub, etc. So very much, Richie is aware of the censorship laws in Japan and is very much trying to critique them, but not in any kind of major national concern, but rather as the articulation of a kind of gay consciousness. Now, this is very much gay male. It's a fantasy world where there are no women present at all. The idea, you could say, of woman does not exist in this film. And that's a certain fantasy. Maybe we could also understand that as misogynist or problematic if we want a more radical or more kind of queer perspective. But I think, especially for a period, a film from the 1960s, just accomplishing this imagination is quite extraordinary and doing it with such care. Very much it seems that the figure of the poet, the writer, he writes, he thinks, he kneels down and seems to be, sucking dick at some point. There's this, suggestively, of course, the reads part, his playmate disappears. But these suggestions of both intimacy, but also a kind of public distance. Again, like Yoko Ono and like High Red Center's shelter plan, playing with ideas of inside and outside, of being concealed but also exposed. And it's this space between nakedness and nudity, neither nakedness nor nudity, that I am trying to argue is the emergence of a very specific deployment of the exposed body, whether it is the female body, Yoko Ono's female body, the exposed male body, in the context of a kind of anti-normative performance, artistic, and filmic practice. So moving forward to move to the conclusion of my lecture, I'd like to introduce you to two more artists, and we won't be watching films, so we'll move through them. Three more artists, excuse me. We'll be moving through them fairly quickly. I'll probably finish the lecture in about 10 minutes. I'd like to introduce you to Yoshiyuki Kohei. So Yoshiyuki Kohei, Yoshiyuki is the family name, was born in 1946, and he's best known for his shocking photo exhibition at the Komai Gallery in Tokyo in 1979 called The Park. The gallery was set up so that there was only black lights inside the gallery. You had to kind of move through a dark curtain to be able to see, and you enter into this dark space where you see a set of photographs that are taken on a 35mm camera using an infrared bulb. So this is the kind of bulb that allows you to take photographs at night in the dark, allows you to see what most people are having trouble seeing, and also will not scare off your photographic subjects because they cannot really see the flash. A kind of hidden camera. And there was an American photographer who used this same technique to take photographs of people in cinemas. But here, Yoshiyuki Kohei, straight man, deploys this in his 1979 exhibition, and also his book published the next year called Documento Koen, Document the Park. Now, some of these images are disturbing. They, again, suggest sexual violence. I don't think, hopefully they're not triggering or problematic too much for anyone, but if they are, please, avert your eyes for a few minutes. There's nothing gory or truly violent, just the suggestion of it. These photographs were taken in Shinjuku and Yoyogi parks, which are two parks on the western side of central Tokyo. And you'll see they record an extraordinary social practice. Because of the high cost of land, the high cost of rent, it became common for couples to meet, avec, from the French avec, to meet in parks in Tokyo. And we can see this in other Asian cities, some even today, where the parks turn at night to a kind of kissing zone and petting zone, and sometimes where that activity is furthered. So here we see a heterosexual couple engaging in sex here behind the bush. Yoshiyuki Kohei was not particularly interested in coitus or in sex alone. He's interested in the observation of sex. And we'll see in this extraordinary practice that he documents where men, knowing that these parks are famous for their abeku, for their the making out, the kissing, the sex that happens, men themselves would assemble, single men, to come and observe and sometimes touch the couple as they have sex. An extraordinary, you could say, invasive, intrusive social practice. And of course, Yoshiyuki Kohei here is documenting this with his camera in a sense, mirroring the kind of intrusion that is happening at the bodily level with his ocular camera, with his infrared bulb. Here we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 men assembling around the couple. Here again, 3 men observing coming close to the couple. Now, interestingly, here we see, of course, the hand itself, the invasion. We can call this a form of rape. It's a touch, sexual touch without consent. And there's some question as to whether the boyfriends, the men who took these women to these spaces, were they aware that this practice would be happening? Were they complicit in this activity? And to what extent is it possible that some women as well knew that this was going on? So these are some questions, I think, that these photographs raise for us. I appreciate Davide Tomio's photograph here. He's looking away, he cannot see. Let's take a look at how gay couples are represented. So the very same photographer photographs gay couples. And while the heterosexual couples are largely horizontal, the gay couples are in fact portrayed in a standing and also much more romantic light. Second photographer who's already came up today is Takano Ryudai. So Takano Ryudai is a much more a contemporary photographer. He's born in 1962, I believe. He won the Kimura Iheisho, the most important prize for new Japanese photographers for his 2005 book, In My Room, and then went on, has published many books of photography since then, but early in his career, established himself as a gay photographer, especially in 2006, Otoko no Norikata, How to Ride a Man, and 2009, Para Para Maria and Para Para Toshihisa. So Para Para are flip books. So these are very small books that you flip with your finger, and in doing so, it looks like a kind of a crude, rudimentary cinema that he made with, we could say, genderqueer individuals. So this is Otoko no Norikata, How to Ride a Man, but we could also here say How to Contact a Man. That's the official English title of the book. And we'll see Takano's particular style of kind of distance and irony. Often he will have an image, sometimes torso-less, sometimes headless, with some kind of description that moves us away from the erotic interest of the photograph. Something like his jeans were part way down, a kind of a flat description that is a text that accompanies each of these images. And while, yes, describing jeans as being part way down might sound like an erotic line, there's a way in which the delivery of it and the location of the text, usually far away from the erotic center of the image, where we can feel this is really a technique of producing distance, irony, and a certain kind of de-eroticization. So counter to Donald Ritchie's film, or to Yoshiyuki Kohei's kind of intensity of feeling, of sentiment, or intensity of sexual aggression, we see here a kind of another movement between naked and nude that is very much about distance. We'll see how this work played out. Here, Takano is playing with the kind of genderqueer body. And also you see here as kind of a splitting of the image. So just like the flip books require a kind of quick cutting, a kind of choppiness as you flip through, Takano is interested in kind of disrupting or cutting apart his own image. This is a photograph from the Aichi Museum show, where we can see again a young man, his genitals exposed. So here, in violation of Japanese obscenity laws, visible for the audience, and this kind of cutting of the body, right, into 6 different panels. Now, it's in 1991, we saw Rie Miyazawa's Santa Fe, Shinoyama Kishin's publication of The Hair Nude. And in Japan, with some kind of mosaic covering, you can often see genitalia to some degree, but it's this kind of direct presentation of the genitalia that were disturbing to contemporary audiences. And in 2006, 2014, at the Aichi Prefectural Museum, the museum was raided, and he was forced, there was a ruling, and we went to court, and it was determined that several of his images that were part of a group show violated Japanese obscenity law. And for this reason, he was forced to either remove them, or here what he chose to do is to cover. Of course, this placing of a kind of diaphanous cloth, you can see partly through it, suggests almost a kind of salacious and horrible kind of embarrassment, some kind of shame here. And we can see Takano Ryudai's deliberate attempt to leave the force of the police, leave the force of the prosecution as a visible part of his art. So there are artists that I would love to describe to you today, which I don't have time to. Barbara Eichhorn, for example, her work in bringing Robert Mapplethorpe's erotic images through Japanese customs and having Japanese customs officers scratch out the genitalia and send them to her. She would create art by getting the customs officials actually involved in the creation of her work. So her work would be to take Robert Mapplethorpe, very famous gay photographer, and to have the Japanese customs officials, in discovering, she would make sure they would discover it, they're required to, of course, obliterate, to cut out with X-Acto knives the offensive genitalia coming from overseas. So she would collect those images and then exhibit them as part of a show. So we see here kinds of engagement with artists engaging with Japanese censorship law. So in closing, thinking about this space between the naked and the nude, I'd like to introduce the work of Eriko Yasuda, who photographed her lover, Julia Yasuda. Julia Yasuda was born in Japan, intersexed, so having quote unquote an extra chromosome, an XXY chromosome, and had a significant career as a professor of material sciences. And in an S&M club in Tokyo, Julia Yasuda met Eriko Yasuda, the photographer. And the two fell in love and had a quite extraordinary visual relationship as a couple until Julia developed cancer and died. Eriko then took on Julia Yasuda's last name. So this is a collection. I don't have time, unfortunately, to kind of go in great detail, but it details, it shows to us the interesting space that is both internal and external. Well, the focus here has been on thinking about spaces between nakedness and nudeness, between interior space and exterior space. And this is a photo collection that layers its photographs, puts over them cellophane, a kind of a tracing paper kind of image with etchings on it, and plays a lot, of course, with the idea of being clothed and unclothed, of revealing. Now, of course, as an intersex person, the whole question of what is to be discovered, quote unquote, what is beneath the clothing, is already a very rich and potent, you could say, social question, and the source of course, discrimination that I think the collaboration between Julia Yasuda and Eriko Yasuda is trying to contest. So I've spoken at great length, and I hope I haven't bored you, but I hope I've presented some examples of the queer Japanese body. We don't have to call it queer, we can just call it people's bodies, but that are being used in these ways to provoke and to disturb, and to call into question any firm distinction between the naked or the nude. Thank you for your attention, and I hope there'll be some questions.
Okay.
Maybe everyone fell asleep.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. This was a huge panoramic overview over nakedness and nudity in a global perspective. Absolutely. And it's not easy to pick up all the questions you raised and to synthesize your really beautifully extended talk. So this semi-public, the naked body, the nude body in a semi-public or semi-private space, for example, this external, internal situation or position and condition of the body is determinant, I think, also because if we relate it also to the obscenity law, that conditions, let us see if we have some questions. Probably there is somebody. Oh my God. Oh, there is something very long. Yes. Maybe you can read in the meanwhile the question.
Yes, okay. After reading Donald Ritchie's very interesting and moving Japan journals, I became interested in the phenomenon of foreign scholars and cruising Japanophiles in post-war Japan, who perhaps sought a greater sexual freedom in this country. It seems to me that there are also elements of Orientalism to consider here, absolutely. Or at least a combination of sexuality and fascination with culture. Say a little more about this, or do you have any suggestions for researching this further? So in terms of one book, there's a book that's dedicated to this topic by John Treat. I'll write it in the chat. John Treat is a professor of Japanese studies who has taught at Yale and also at the University of Washington. I think he's now in Arizona. He has a title that's a play on the very important Tokugawa era, Edo period, compendium of male-male love stories called The Great Mirror of Male Love. And Treat takes that title and changes it to Great Mirrors Shattered. So this is a title that I think would be very interesting for you because it looks precisely at the tradition of gay Orientalism, gay male Orientalism in Japan research. So many of the important translators, whether it was Meredith Weatherby, who I mentioned, Yato Tamotsu's lover, was the translator for Mishima, Seidensticker, another important figure. So many kind of gay men ending up, especially American gay men ending up in Tokyo. So I think it's definitely Orientalism is there. And in looking at the photographs of Yato Tamotsu, you can trace the kind of production of a fantasy Japanese body for not just American consumers. It's not just for the American visitors, but also for a new kind of emerging post-war gay sensibility that I think combines both American Orientalism and Japanese nativism and some ideas of quote unquote, progress or sexual liberation. It's a very kind of complex kind of concatenation or overlaying of forces there. It's a really great question. I would recommend you take a look at Donald Ritchie's, if you are interested, take a look at his famous travelogue. So his famous travelogue is called, what is it called? It's about going to the, oh, it's called the Inland Sea. Sorry, Inland Sea, the Inland Sea. Yes, and so this is like considered one of the, probably among the 20 best examples of travel writing in the 20th century. It's a very high reputation. The rest of Donald Ritchie's fiction was maybe not so great, but the Inland Sea is a really important example of travel writing, and it doesn't take much kind of extra thinking to encounter or to discover the sexual relations that are just lying underneath the surface of that story. So I would recommend, if you've read it already, go back and read it again with that in mind, or if you haven't read it, take a look at it. This fantasy of a kind of Japanese, immediately post-war Japanese space of a kind of uncomplicated sexuality. It's really a fantasy, or totally Orientalist fantasy, but a quite beautifully done one. Yes. Any other thoughts or questions? I hope I didn't put you all to sleep.
No.
Can I ask a question?
Perfetto. Yes.
Good evening, Professor.
Hello.
Hello. I very much appreciated your presentation. It was really enlightening, and really I was really interested in the matter. So my question was about you referring about the dancer Takao Kawaguchi.
Yes.
And it inspired me this question about the performing arts that arose after the war times, the ending war times, in particular the Buto dance, portrayed and created by Katsuono. I believe, I remember that Takao Kawaguchi had some correlation with Katsuono. So I wanted to know if in the Buto performances nowadays also, the obscenity law still can have an influence on the performing arts, and how Buto also in a way change the idea of the performance of the body, because sometimes also the body can be disclosed and in parts naked. So that was my question. Thank you very much.
Yes, it's a really great question. And I actually think Professor Centonze is probably better equipped to answer that than I am. But let me make a few quick comments, and then perhaps she will have something much more erudite and much more substantial to say than me. But what we can see is a very selective application of the obscenity laws. And again, I'm not an expert in this area, but it's my understanding that, for example, the references to homosexuality and the use of nakedness or semi-nakedness on the stage were largely not the target of any kind of organized police action for the large part. Partly because these were spaces where we see a kind of artificial separation of the space of ankoku buto from the space of male homosexuality. There is a lot of kind of coming and going of thoughts and of ideas. Mishima was a great kind of patron to Hijikata Tatsumi, who founds Buto. But there's also a kind of understanding, it seems to me, that the homosexuality that's being talked about is conceptual, it's artistic, it's beautiful, or it's disgusting, it's French, it's genet. It's something that is not about real life. And so I think part of the issue here is, I'm doing some work right now that's actually about looking at how those spaces intersect. And in fact, Donald Ritchie, his very first film done in Japan called Gisei is done with Hijikata Tatsumi. And there's a very, very interesting intersection of the world of gay male desire with Hijikata's choreography. Generally, most Hijikata scholars don't look at this film because it's not a hijikata film. It's a film where he quote unquote just did the choreography. But I also think that also speaks to a certain kind of homophobia in the field. So I think it's really time for us to go back and look at what was homosexuality and gay male desire functioning in a more lived sense. And there's some other connections, other individuals who really actually do connect those separate worlds. But again, I think Professor Chen Tongzin knows better than me, but I suspect that there is the understanding of male homosexuality in these arts as quote unquote, at the level of representation, kind of functioning like a nude does, right? Functioning in an objectified fashion, not concerned with actually the desire of the person depicted. And that's a very interesting space. I think you also see this in avant-garde film. Like, there's so many avant-garde artists who are very fascinated with Jean Genet. Somewhat a little bit in the United States as well. We can see the beat generation, you know, American beat writers also interested in Genet. But in the case of the American beats, we do see actually very significant gay male writers like Allen Ginsberg, you know, who are part of that movement, which can also explain the connection. Whereas in Japan, whether it's Oshima Nagisa or even Matsumoto Toshio, you see straight men taking a strong conceptual interest in male homosexuality for what it represents for their artistic and political purposes. I hope that was a helpful answer. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe I spoke too quickly as well.
No, not at all. It was articulated very well. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great question.
Just maybe to add something to this, it's sure that nakedness, it was a revolution that the naked body appeared on a stage in Japan in '59. So, and I think that hijikata inspired a lot of artists. Even the photos you showed of Nakanishi, High Red Center, the naked body seen from behind of a man, it's intertwined with hijikata's art because they later collaborated after in '63 and '64. So, but that's what I wanted to ask you. The naked body in a theater in contemporary Japan is absolutely not. I don't want to say it's not possible, but it's usually not possible. So, for example, when you put on the scene, when you put on your performance Touch of the Other, Kawaguchi Takao was not naked. He had this clothes on, and he was half naked. While in alternative theaters like Terpsichore in Nakano and so on, you have several naked performances and nobody has strange reactions. So on one side, it's normal to see a naked body on a stage, but it depends where. And another example is Akarenga, the theater in Yokohama. In 2060, the same year of Touch of the Other, Takao had this performance with other contemporary performers, Ohashi Kakuya, and I think it was Iwabuchi Teita. The first night they performed naked, completely naked, and the director of the theater prohibited to reply on the next day the same performance, so they had to dress. So it's this kind of, it depends on the theater, because the normal law is not of public obscenity. It is considered public obscenity if a naked body appears in a theater. So I wanted to understand better if with Touch of the Other you had problems like this.
Yes, so in Touch of the Other in Tokyo, we performed at Spiral Hall in Aoyama, which you could say it's not one of the most famous theaters, but it does tend towards more general audience. It's very supportive of LGBT issues. It's been the supporter of the Rainbow Film Festival, the former Tokyo Lesbian Gay International Film Festival, for more than 20 years. So it's a very progressive space. But still, it wasn't just Takao's performance, but also we had a film inside like a short film that was part of the performance that was done by Imaizumi Koichi, which was a reenactment of one of the toilet scenes.
Yes, I remember.
In the very toilet. And we were required to put to block the image. Now the director, of course, was very upset by this, and so he created this giant red bar to kind of emphasize the censorship. Yes, I think it's still a very sensitive issue, especially for more public-oriented places.
Yes.
I think that's also the issue in the Aichi Museum, Prefectural Museum incident, because this is a place that is open to the public. You know, the public can go in. It doesn't require, you know, I think the argument is that unlike a book, which you must actively purchase, here you may simply happen to see art that you weren't intending to see. Of course, you must purchase a ticket to go into the museum, so the logic isn't completely fully laid out. But yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Katja, for pointing that out.
Thank you very much. Oh, here is a question. What shall we do, Sabrina-san?
Oh, it's from you.
Let's read the...
Yes, do we see a conscience within the space of art creation that isn't the state regulating what can be shown? Instead, that thinks of what should be shown. Is academia or queer studies this force? Is feminism? Oh, what a great question. So where does the kind of alternative to the state, is there a space that is not about state regulation, but about kind of creative expression? And where is that? If it can't happen on the stage or in the museum? That's a really great question. I think it's my impression that in terms of LGBTQ issues, that the Japanese Academy is not especially supportive. So there are some scholars, but they tend in Japan, LGBTQ scholars, not to necessarily be in the world of performance, but more in sociology. It's kind of associated with a very different discipline. I mean, there are some out or semi-out scholars, but in terms of actually supporting new spaces of creation, no. I would suggest that one place to look at would be a group now defunct called Dumb Type. And Dumb Type is, Takao Kawaguchi was also in Dumb Type, but they were a very active group originating in Kyoto. And yes, thank you, Linda. So they originated in Kyoto, and they were very much organized around contesting and fighting against the AIDS crisis before the development of AIDS drug cocktail. And one of their members, Furuhashi Teiji, one of the central members, became ill, came down with HIV, and eventually, died actually of AIDS while in the performance. I mean, not on stage, but while they were touring. So the group was a very sensitive, and has done some extraordinary work. Recently, the group is no longer called Dumb Type. It's become more beautiful, but also maybe a little more conservative or a little more theoretical, you know. So, yeah, I think it's a real difficult, Japan is in a difficult space. There are not a lot of, the number of local theaters is already quite small, and then it's getting smaller and smaller. I think the number of venues is quite limited, and the space for where kind of new LGBTQ thinking and creation can happen is really limited. It sounds like a very unsatisfactory thing to say, but I think that's the case. I mean, of course there are artists, there are people doing things, but yeah, it's overall feels quite contained, I think.
Yes.
Would you agree, Professor Chentonze?
So you can call me Katja.
All right.
No, absolutely, because besides the censorship in Japan, we should also remember the self-censorship. And so it's a very peculiar area of artistic creation or of politically voicing something, because I think it's not so easy to voice politically in Japan your ideas, or to shape them and to show them or to express. So I think we should do this discussion. We should do another discussion, Jonathan, I think. Professor Hall, I'm sorry. And no, because I think we only started something. So this is only the beginning of really a lot of issues that concern, let's say, Japanese culture or the East Asia culture. So, and every issue should be taken. Let's say there is also mappadaka, the other word for nakedness, complete nakedness in Japan. So it's a so diversified world that it needs really several sessions of your lectures, I suppose. And it was really great today to have you with us and to listen to this huge, really, this talk which starts from one point and ends in another point. So it's really, I'm really grateful. And I think, Sabrina, you can also say something if you want to.
Yes.
Anche in italiano, as you like.
No, okay. I mean, I was just typing that since Professor Chentonze was saying that in the future it would be nice to explore these other words more. If you want and if you're available, we of Geshin would love to have you again if you want to.
Oh, it would be great fun.
Yes. And I mean, all right. So I don't see any other questions. I don't see anybody else who wishes to talk using other Zoom applications. So I would say that we can close the conference, unfortunately, because I think it was really interesting and really, as you were talking, I kept getting messages about how good it was and how interesting it was. So I'm happy to share this with you. And I thank you again for being here tonight, tonight for us, today for you. And I hope to see you again. Per quanto riguarda voi che siete rimasti, insomma, grazie mille per essere stati qui fino alla fine. Vi ricordo, perché questo semestre non ci sono più attività, però da febbraio ripartiremo con le nostre attività. Tenetevi informati sui nostri canali social, che sono YouTube e Facebook, e abbiamo appena aperto anche un canale Facebook, Instagram e YouTube. E abbiamo anche aperto appunto un canale YouTube da poco. Quindi caricheremo lì questa conferenza e altre passate che abbiamo registrato. Quindi grazie mille e buona serata a tutti.
Thank you.
Grazie. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Sabrina.
Everyone.
Thank you to everyone.